Hello class, and welcome to tuning in for week 5, where we will be exploring Joan Baez's Saigon Bride. Now, this song is so quintessentially a protest folk song of the 1960s that it just really encapsulates a lot of the themes of this course and of this week. This is especially true of the through line of social activism and social justice as being involved in rock music, as well as sort of all the various forms that rock music can take under this broader umbrella of rock music, and of course even wider than that of popular music. So getting to see how Joan Baez is involved in social justice and activism through music, I think is really remarkable and sort of ties this first unit of the first 5 weeks, and especially the 1960s, together in a nice bow. So without further ado, let's dive in. Alright, so I really have come to appreciate and dive into Joan Baez more recently than when I made some of the videos for Soundbites. So as the Soundbites video currently stands, the artists of protest music that I tend to focus on are ones like Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Yoko Ono, Marvin Gaye, but Joan Baez is very much a titan that stands right along with them, and I wish I could go back and include Baez in that Soundbites video, maybe in a future iteration of the course. But in lieu of that, let me go ahead and cover some of Baez's biography and achievements here before we dive into the music. Now, Joan Baez was huge in the folk music scene in the early 1960s, right on through the decade and even in the decades to follow. She was mentored by Pete Seeger, a folk music legend who was quite involved in protest music, and sort of formed the link from Pete Seeger to Bob Dylan in Bob Dylan's rise and early career. In fact, Joan Baez had a quite famous romantic relationship with Bob Dylan that lasted from 1961 to 1965, and broke up after Bob Dylan's famous tour to England, and it was actually Joan Baez who advocated for Dylan's early career and sort of introduced him to the public. They would play shows together, or she would sing some of the songs that he wrote. So it's safe to say that without Joan Baez and her career and visibility, we wouldn't have Bob Dylan as we have today in the way that he's so well known. Now, Joan Baez actually pressured Bob Dylan to be, believe it or not, more political in his messaging, and sort of more explicitly political and activist, and that was one of the reasons why they ended up parting ways. But for Joan Baez's part, she explicitly sang for freedom, for civil rights, for nonviolence and pacifism, especially during the Vietnam War period, but also as well in the decades after. She sang and fought for unionization and for social justice in general. We'll see sort of where a lot of that comes from. Now, one thing that I found significant to highlight is that Joan Baez's activism really stems from her Quaker upbringing, Quaker faith. Now, Quakers are a Christian denomination, but one that is very distinct in its pursuit of social justice activism. So they're less evangelical in trying to convert others to join their faith, and more about letting their actions speak louder than words. And through social justice activism and charity work and the like, just really making sure to have an active presence in society. So Joan Baez learned these lessons well from her Quaker upbringing and was involved in the practice of Quaker faith through activism, especially partnering with Quaker speakers like Ira Sandpearl to advocate for pacifism and nonviolence. Her father was also a UNESCO, that's the UN Commission on Cultural Preservation, researcher for UNESCO, which meant that she was often traveling in sort of in folk spaces and getting to experience other cultures and other music traditions especially. Now, in addition to being beloved as a folk singer, Joan Baez was involved in many of the most landmark activist moments of the decade. Most prominently, the 1963 March on Washington, most famously known for Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, but it was Joan Baez who sang We Shall Overcome at that rally, so quite a high honor and involvement in the civil rights movement. Joan Baez also sang at Woodstock, as you learned in one of the videos, although it didn't really focus on Baez's involvement. Now, in terms of achievements and honors, Joan Baez was given, in 2007, the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, and in 2017, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So again, this kind of shows this nebulous ambiguity in what counts as rock music or rock and roll music. Joan Baez, as a folk singer, I think hardly fits a lot of the musical definitions that you might look at for rock. There's no backbeat, no distorted guitars, but just sort of as part of this broader tradition, especially in terms of the socially turbulent 1960s, she gains recognition as part of this socially active tradition. And then I also want to highlight Joan Baez received an ACLU, that's the American Civil Liberties Union, Earl Warren Award for promoting human and civil rights causes. So her impact just in a number of different civil rights causes throughout the years was well recognized and celebrated. Okay, but let's talk music now, specifically for Saigon Bride. Now, you can find the song in the playlist, and I will go ahead and play parts of it, but I really encourage you to listen to the whole thing. Now, as always, we start out with rhythm, which is a little bit misleading because in this song, rhythm really does not drive the song. It's not a very prominent factor. So because this is a folk ballad, it leaves a lot of space rhythmically to focus on the lyrics, to focus on the narrative of the story. It's almost like it kind of sucks you in by creating a negative space rhythmically to where there's not a lot of groove going on, so you can just focus on what the vocals are saying. However, a few rhythmic things of note here. One, the song is in compound meter, specifically 6/8 time signature. So I mentioned this all the way back in the Elements of Music video, but the thing to note is that most of the music that we hear is in simple meter. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and not only just simple meter, but specifically 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. In contrast, compound meter sounds a little bit more flowy and has beats that are subdivided into three. One lolly, two lolly, one lolly, two lolly, merrily, 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 merrily. So because of that, it creates more of a flowy texture than a typical rock, that should say beat. So like with the backbeat, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is much more flowy. This is particularly articulated by the finger-picked guitar. So finger-picking meaning the guitarist is using the fingers rather than the pick to pick specific strings at a time, and sort of goes across the 6 strings of the guitar in a certain pattern. So this provides a gentle flowing subdivision that gives us that compound meter. One lolly, two lolly, one lolly, two lolly, one lolly, two lolly, and so on. I'll play a clip of that after this. For Baez's part, the rhythm of her vocals is free-flowing and very off-grid. Instead of being like rhythmically exact, it's more conversational. Like she doesn't mind placing some of the notes sort of out of time, so it's not exactly rhythmically accurate. It helps to give it a more conversational tone, like she's just telling you this story, telling you these poetic lines. So she has a really masterful sense of timing, specifically by being off the grid, sort of off the beaten path.
Farewell, my wistful Saigon bride, I'm going out to stem the tide, a tide which never saw the seas. It flows through.
But now let's talk about melody, which is the most prominent parameter in this particular song. So the melody of this song has relatively more skips than most songs would. Most of the melodies we've been looking at have been sort of more mostly stepwise, da 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 da, and then occasionally a skip, da bum bum, something like that. But the fact that there is more skips throughout really shows off the virtuosity of Baez's voice. So overall, the contour has this sort of wave-like quality, up and down, up and down. It's almost hypnotic. It sort of doesn't head anywhere like in terms of destination. It just kind of goes back and forth very gently, like a lullaby. So that's this sort of motion of da 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 da. See how it keeps going up back to these repeated peaks. So it's not like the highest is a goal point of the phrase. It's more like it just keeps skipping up and down, part of this overall wave-like motion. Each verse comes to a closed cadence at the end of the phrase. Now, when the first verse is on the line, it will not matter when we're dead. It will not matter when we're dead. So there's a dun-dum. And it comes to the valley, the lowest point in the phrase, which also is a stable point of closure within the scale. Oops, I had to get rid of a line there about Aretha Franklin from the last tuning in video. But here we go. So the melodic segmentation for the melody is interesting because it's all very interrelated. It sort of does the same thing. So in general, you have X and X. The da 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 da. It's one X. Da 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 da. Repeats the X, and then it kind of goes down. It does the same thing but just lower. Da 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 da. So that would be a Y, although it's still a related Y. And then the Y prime to end out the phrase. Da 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 da. So that makes it a difference because it comes to a different point to end. So remember the idea of motive, which is sort of this melodic idea that ties it all together. In this case, it literally does tie it all together because Baez is always singing that wave-like motion, up and down, the same motive that relates all the melody throughout. So even the Y part is still basically the X, but just transposed exactly to a lower part of the scale. Next, let's take a look at harmony. So the harmony is quite simple. It plays a 2-chord loop for a while. So the whole so chord 1, 2, so 2 chords that just alternate. So it alternates between those two for the first 2 lines of the phrase, and then it lowers. It repeats the same 2-chord loop, but transposed lower. And that's for the melody part that also does the same thing, that lowers just a little bit. So the harmony basically consists of 2 2-chord loops. Now the interesting thing about this, and forgive me if I get a little bit in the weeds for this, is there's a fundamental opposition between major and minor. Remember that major and minor are sort of those 2 chord types which have a very different quality, a different sound. So a major sounds like this, da 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 dum, sort of bright and happy, while a minor sounds a little darker, more melancholy, da 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 dum. And those two kind of form an opposition that drives a lot of music, especially classical music. Now here, because we sort of have a major chord for a while, 2-chord loop, and then it goes down to the relative minor, which is in technical terms would be chord 1 going to chord 6. So it has a sense of like an opposition between the major and sinking down to the minor, which kind of brings out the theming of the song's lyrics. Now, in terms of this harmonic layer, the brass chorale that you hear, the brass instruments in the beginning and the end and sort of throughout the piece, provides a chorale harmony. That basically means that there's more moving parts. Instead of just playing one block chord all at once, the voices sort of move independently of each other, and sort of one voice will move at a time and then another voice will move. sort of creates a more smooth, viscous texture throughout. And finally, it's just worth noting that the finger-picked guitar that we mentioned earlier is arpeggiating the chordal harmony, meaning it's taking, instead of one chord strummed all at once, you sort of have so you're getting all the chord tones spread out over the course of a measure. Alright, next we have texture and timbre to talk about. So, in terms of texture, it's quite simple, consistent with a folk song style. It foregrounds the melodic layer, Joan Baez's voice, front and center. The brass functions as a novelty layer. Certainly that's not a timbre that you'll hear in every single piece, although Penny Lane was a previous piece that we saw that also used brass as a novelty layer. The guitar, of course, plays the role of the chord layer, as it often does, and there's no real beat or bass layer in this track. You could say the guitar still plays that role, like by going da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da for the beat, but it's not like you have a drum beat layer, so I would just say there's not really a beat or bass layer here. Now, on the note of texture, I think it's worth noting that the brass here, these sort of classical music elements that are being worked in for reasons that we'll talk about in just a bit, are elements that are orchestrated by the classical music composer Peter Schickele. So Joan Baez chose to collaborate with Peter Schickele to provide orchestration for this album and sort of enhance some of the narrative associations for each of these ballads. Now, in terms of timbre, Joan Baez's voice and the overall sort of tone of the track is wistful. I think that's a fair description of it. And it's also very smooth and clean. Now, interestingly, Baez features a good deal of vibrato, which is sort of this rah, 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 sort of like warbling or vibrating in her voice, yet that still sort of contributes to the overall cleanness and wistfulness of the track. You definitely get the sense of just sitting around a campfire and listening to someone with a guitar sort of tell this story in a musical way. Now, with the track's timbre being so clean and smooth, just, not with a lot of gritty textures or sort of sharp instruments, that helps to foreground the vocals and the lyrics, which will be important in just a bit. Now, I did want to make a bit of a note about the brass in terms of the ADSR, attack, sustain, delay, release. Here, the brass has a high amount of sustain, which sort of gives it that gooey, gluey texture. Just sort of gluing everything together. The brass is played at a very soft dynamic for brass, these trumpets, trombones, and horns, with gentle attack. Overall, this gives it what's known in music as a legato feel, rather than a staccato feel. Now, this is important because usually when you think of brass, especially like in the context of a fanfare, it's very like da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So this sort of like high attack, a sharper staccato sound. But here, Peter Schickele has orchestrated and recorded the brass to be maximally smooth, telling the players to come in with almost no perceptible attack, so just sort of almost the chords changing from one another without you even really noticing. And so in that way, the timbre of the brass chords is almost like strings, just sort of like gluing everything together with an almost imperceptible attack. And I think that really contributes to the overall feel of the song. Alright, let's go ahead and talk about form. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more about that brass. The brass gives the introduction to the piece, which is really quite striking when you're sort of coming at it expecting either just a single folk guitar or more of a rock music aesthetic. They also hold the last chord for a long time to sort of create an outro tail. Now, here's where I'm going to sort of bring it home and give a reading of the brass. Here I think that the brass really evokes two things. One, a funeral image, a funeral sound, and a military sound. So, of course, when we hear brass, we think most of the military, sort of like brass fanfares and the like, but another place that we hear brass used is in a funeral, such as the song Taps that gets played at military funerals. Here, with the timbre of the brass being so smooth and so soft, we definitely have more of a funereal vibe than a strictly like military fanfare. It's not people rushing off to war, although that is kind of the narrative context of it, but rather it gives more of a funeral vibe, like mourning and lament. I think that's important to the message of the piece. Now, the form of the song is very simple. It's all verses. It's in what is known as strophic form, which means just verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4. There's no change in the form with like a chorus or something to give a contrast to it. It's just progressive verses that help to advance the narrative and tend to bring more focus onto the words, more focus onto the lyrics and the story. Now, it is worth noting that even though we kind of just have verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4, just continual verses, the verses do have a slight variation in length. When you look at the lyrics on a lyrics page, some of the verses are 6 lines in length, and some of them are 4. All that happens is for the stanzas that have 6 lines in length, that sort of minor mode part where the melody goes lower and the chords go lower, that is just repeated once. So you sort of get, instead of x, x, y, y prime, it's like x, x, y, y prime, y, y double prime. So it just sort of gets a little longer with more y's. We also have an instrumental section between some of the verses, which is just the guitar arpeggiation with this synthesized chime that just kind of goes bong, bong, which to me almost sounds like there's sort of like an epiphany. Like it's very contemplative between the verses, and this chime is sort of meant to represent almost like a light bulb going off. So the instrumental occurs after every pair of verses. You have 1 and 2, then an instrumental, 3 and 4, and then the instrumental, and then 5 and 6 after. Each time the instrumental occurs, it follows these sort of pair of rhetorical questions. And so the last thing that you hear before each instrumental, the first time you have, how many children must we kill before we make the waves stand still? And then the instrumental with the chime. And the second time we have, how many dead to reach the stars? And then the second instrumental. So it's almost sort of creating this space to contemplate the weight of what was just said.
How many men to conquer Mars? How many dead to reach the stars?
All right, and finally we get to the lyrics, which, as I mentioned, is really a focus in this song and in most folk songs and folk music. So this is an excellent demonstration of using a folk ballad as a protest song, specifically a protest of the Vietnam War. In the title, Saigon Bride, Saigon refers to a city in Vietnam, which is now known as Ho Chi Minh City, the most populous city in Vietnam. And so that sets up this narrative frame that you get in the very first verse of a Vietnamese soldier leaving his wife, his newly wedded bride, to go and fight in the war, sort of being called in as a soldier. Now this demonstrates the power of perspective, that here in Joan Baez's song, she's doing something really subversive at the time in the 1960s, and that is sort of using the power of perspective to show sympathy to the Vietnamese soldiers, the Vietnamese country. Just imagine if the United States is at war with a country and then you hear a song where the perspective is being told from a soldier of that country. It's really sort of like taking the other side's shoes, so to speak, and that was really subversive and I think revolutionary at the time. Now, while much of the song takes the Vietnamese perspective, other parts seem to step back and really survey the entire global human condition. So, for example, the line, how many children must we kill before we make the waves stand still? So it sort of has this essence of futility that we'll talk about in a second, but the we there very much seems to be identified with the speakers, with Joan Baez, with us here in the United States that is listening to this song. So there it's no longer speaking in a Vietnamese perspective per se, but really zooming out to encapsulate all of humanity. Now, one thing I really want to highlight about folk music overall is the high quality of its lyrics as sort of poetry in itself. That was a big focus for the folk musicians. And we saw this with Bob Dylan, who was granted a Nobel Prize for Literature, so for the poetry of his lyrics. And here in Joan Baez's Saigon Bride, we have very much the same level of quality, if not better. So, first of all, there's the oceanic imagery, which gets used to sort of indicate futility. So things like, I'm going out to stem the tide, sort of trying to beat back the waves. And talking about the ocean flowing through jungles, kind of like a river, asking, is the water flow yellow or is it red? Like red as in stained by blood. And then, how many dead will it take to make the waves stand still? Again, that essence of futility. There's also really high-quality poetry elsewhere, such as men die to build their pharaohs' tombs, the sense that it's the common person who is really suffering and dying for the cause of the elites, the government, the politicians, who are sort of weaving their machinations. And to still and still the teeming wombs, really just bringing it home about the hordes of children, some as young as teenagers, preteens even, who are dying to fight in this war. And then finally, as I've alluded to on previous slides, Joan Baez works in some powerful pacifist lines which really advocate against the war, and the Vietnam War in particular, and war in general, and for nonviolence. How many children must we kill? How many men to conquer Mars? There again with that sort of futility and just piling up of bodies. How many dead to reach the stars? And then that sort of final line that closes the song, it will not matter when we're dead. So by using the narrative frame of a Vietnamese soldier leaving the Saigon Bride to go and fight in the war, and then ending with this line, it will not matter when we're dead, Joan Baez really just sort of creates this atmosphere of the pervasiveness of death in the Vietnam War to just really raise, I think, a cry of lament and a cry of protest against the symbol of death that the war became. Alright, so that's going to do it for this week's Tuning In video. I hope you enjoyed learning about Joan Baez and about Saigon Bride, which is just a really powerful song, even if it's a bit sobering to hear and to dive into. I think it really encapsulates the spirit of the folk protest music of the 1960s. But seriously, go and listen to the full song, Saigon Bride. It's on the playlist, beyond just the snippets I've included here. I really enjoyed getting to research Joan Baez and Saigon Bride for this teaching video, and I think you'll appreciate listening back to the song with some of the context and the musical analysis that we've talked about as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and sign off and say, I hope you tune in next time.